Chapter 26, R.A.F. North Front, Gibraltar. On our first visit to Gibraltar, as a family, we had arrived by sea on the voyage to Singapore. This time we went by land through the Spanish and Gibraltar customs posts on each side of the road about a mile long. This road, not surprisingly, called the Spanish Road, traversed a stretch of land leading into the Gibraltar Peninsula, known as No Man's Land. The occupation of the territory of the colony had been the source of dispute between Spain and Britain for a very long time, and during our tour of Gibraltar it was to get a great deal worse. Right of occupation by Britain had been granted under the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. However, when we entered the colony at the end of January, 1965, there were no delays. I duly reported into R.A.F. North Front, which is only yards from the Gibraltar side of the border. After the usual arrival formalities we drove into the town and booked into our hotel, where we were to stay for about 10 days whilst my predecessor handed over command of the squadron to me. We were due to move into the married quarter tied to the appointment of officer commanding flying at number 224 Squadron, which was a dual role for the incumbent. John Patterson, whom I was to succeed, greeted me on my first day and formally introduced me to the squadron members. We also called on the station commander, Group Captain Wilson Smith and other senior officers. To my surprise I learned that there was a move afoot to put the wing commander administration into my quarter. Fortunately, a very old friend of mine was on a visit from HQ Coastal Command, who was in a position to stop this move, and duly did so on his return to HQ in London. As a result, after a couple weeks we moved into the quarter concerned. This was one of the perks of the appointment, as this quarter was a lovely spacious residence on the edge of the beach, with a spectacular view of Algeciras Bay. The house was two-storied and the main bedroom had a large veranda to enjoy this view to the full. One could also watch the western half of the runway and to the south only half a mile away, the famous Rock itself. We took over the two female Spanish servants who previously looked after the house and the cooking. They were part of the workforce of some 10,000 Spaniards who crossed daily into Gib from La Linea to work in the colony. The officers' mess was only a few yards from our quarter, very convenient if you had imbibed a bit too much. The colony itself was only a couple of miles wide and about 6 miles long, dominated by the 1,350 feet high rock. This rock soars up in the form of a sheer cliff, a quarter of a mile from the runway. More of the problem in flying in and out of Gib. Later, the Spanish road dissects the main runway and, whenever aircraft are using the runway, the road has to be closed. The main part of the town of Gibraltar is on the western side of the rock, facing Algeciras, across the several-mile-wide bay. The huge naval dockyards, where the Royal Navy have operated ever since a British conquest of the colony in 1783, is also on this side. The Bay of Algeciras opens out into the Straits of Gibraltar and into the Atlantic. The straits are 11 miles wide from Europa Point, the southernmost tip of Europe, and the North African coast. When we were in Gib an average 22,000 ships pasted through the straits every year, traversing between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. It is, of course, one of the great seaways of the world and for that reason alone a place of considerable strategic value and an unceasing activity and interest. Across from Gib is the Spanish colony port of Ceuta and the Moroccan port of Tangier. We would, in due course, visit many ports of Spain, Portugal and Tangier on days off, or leave periods. It certainly was a great place to be stationed. In addition to the Air Force and the Navy, the Army had a battalion and supporting services in the garrison. The rock held a labyrinth of tunnels all constructed for operational reasons, as havens and stores for the various wars in which Gibraltar has played such a vital role. The town had a great variety of low-price shops with a very wide choice of goods. There was also a magnificent fruit and vegetable market selling all the superb agricultural and horticultural produce bought and daily from Spain. The climate is a good one, with long hot summers and mild winters, with the main problems in winter being the high winds and frequent rain showers. There is a famous wind called the Levanter, and when this blows, flying conditions become extremely dicey. More again on this point later. We soon settled into life in Gib and to the never-ending social whirl. There were endless visitors from UK, and every naval ship that came in gave a reception or cocktail party. Drink was cheap, so entertaining was no real problem. As the wearer of two hats, that of OC Flying and OC 224 Squadron, we received invitations to most things. The governor of the colony was Lieutenant General Sir Gerald Lascelles, who made his name during the Mau Mau troubles in Kenya, where he was the general in charge of British troops. He was a most impressive military figure and a fine governor. During our tour we were entertained to dinner by His Excellency and Lady Lascelles, which involves an old tradition. Whilst at the table, an army sergeant reports to the governor's table and deposits a large key. This key is the one for the main gate to the city, and handing it over to HE signifies that the gate is locked in the fortress, therefore, secure. At Kinloss I had been flying the Shackleton Mark I, and 224 Squadron was equipped with Mark II. There were certain differences which I had to become familiar with, so I flew a couple of conversion sorties with the squadron training officer. Almost as soon as I got settled in, I was off on a squadron detachment for 2.5 weeks. Each year every coastal squadron went to Ballykelly near Londonderry in Northern Ireland for a special training period. The training was conducted by the Joint Anti-Submarine School, JAS, a combined Air Force and naval unit. These training periods were called JASOCs. I did not have a crew of my own, but flew with all the crews as commander. The crew captain of each crew I flew with kept his designation as captain. This system ensured that I flew regularly on exercises with all the squadron crews. On local routine flying training I took over a crew and flew as captain. On the 2nd of March we flew overnight in an 11-hour flight to R.A.F Ballykelly, and I flew with Flight Lieutenant Ken Williamson, who was captain of one of the most experienced crews and due to return to UK soon. He was a fine officer and an excellent pilot, and we enjoyed a good flight. In those days Northern Ireland was relatively peaceful, for the serious troubles with the IRA that have occurred over the past 20 years or so were still to come. Northern Ireland was a thoroughly enjoyable place to visit in 1965. The JAS course consisted of discussion ground exercises with our naval counterparts at the school premises. The studies provided the background prior to the flying part of the training. The main exercise was to work with naval surface vessels in hunting and attacking submarines. RN submarines provided the quarry, and we operated off the western coast of Ireland and Scotland well out into the Atlantic. The sorties we flew were long ones, usually about 10 to 12 hours duration, both night and day. We were flying out of the R.A.F base at Ballykelly, just a few miles out of Londonderry. One combined night and day sortie was quite dramatic. We climbed out over the mountains of Northern Ireland in storm conditions, when all of a sudden, we were at 8,000 feet. There was a blinding flash as the aircraft was struck by lightning. The captain and I managed between us to keep control of the aircraft. For the few seconds we were blinded. Fortunately, there appeared to be no serious damage to instruments or navigation aids, radio and radar, etc. On clearing the coast we descended to our patrol height of 1,000 feet. It was very turbulent, due to the winds of 45 knots and above. The rough conditions caused considerable air sickness amongst all the crew. Daylight came, revealing the exceptionally high seas below. We saw many ships being tossed around like corks. At one stage the captain and I went up front, handling the controls. Were the only two members of the crew who were not airsick. It was a very weary crew that returned to Ballykelly, very thankful to be back on the ground. We flew a second night and day sortie the following night in much better conditions. Apart from the flying we had no other duties during the flying phase. During these stand-down phases and for 2 weekends, we were off duty, which enabled me to play a few rounds of golf on the lovely Northern Ireland courses. We played a couple of rounds in Era, one near Buncrana in Donegal and another right on the west coast. Another squadron commander, Ken Robertson, and I went and stayed at a country pub for a couple of nights and played golf at the nearby links. These social occasions were really great enjoyment, as along with others we enjoyed the odd evening out, going round the very hospitable Irish pubs. No doubt a very rare experience for British servicemen these past years since the Troubles. The course at JAS completed, we flew overnight back to Gib. It was good to be back and able to enjoy the warm spring Mediterranean weather. Valerie was now all set up for her forthcoming marriage, and Sean was to fly down at the end of his course at Easter, and they were to be married on that Easter Saturday. Padre Price, the station chaplain, was to officiate in the ceremony to be held in the station church, with the reception being held in the officers' mess. It was a marvelous setting for the Easter wedding on the 19th of April, 1965. Meanwhile, as the excitement mounted, I carried on flying regularly and enjoyed doing so immensely. It was a great place to fly out of, with that superb scenery and endless shipping activity on the surrounding seas. I never got over the excitement of it all, but it was a very challenging airfield to fly in and out of. There cannot be very many airfields in the world with a piece of real estate almost 1,400 feet high, only a quarter of a mile off the side of the only runway. There is a sheer face at this point, and about 3/4 of the way up the cliff, there is a grim reminder of what can happen. A large black oil stain is still clearly visible, resulting from when a Wellington bomber flew straight into the rock during the war. Another special hazard at Gib is severe turbulence and a very tricky wind situation when the wind blows from the south above 15 knots in the sector 50 degrees to 230 degrees. When the wind is in this sector and above 15 knots, it splits both sides of the rock, resulting in a tailwind at one end of the runway and a headwind at the other, or vice versa. On approach, especially from the east along the 260 degrees runway heading, one experiences severe turbulence and sudden downdrafts. All aircraft approaching Gib are warned of the conditions, and in the case of R.A.F. aircraft, if the captain has not approached Gib before under such conditions, he is given a mandatory division elsewhere. If he has had experience of these conditions, he can make a couple of attempts to get in and, if unsuccessful, then divert. In the case of civil aircraft, air traffic warned the captains of these conditions and advised them that if they attempt to land, it is entirely under their own responsibility. The problem also with the split wind is that, as you get over the threshold of the runway, you experience a sudden change of wind from head to tailwind. As you may have a lot of power on to negotiate the downdraft, you can suddenly find yourself in an overshoot position. The rule is that you must overshoot if you're not firmly and safely on the ground before the Spanish road, which lies across the halfway point on the runway. I once remember, with horror, seeing an R.A.F. Comet IV, with half the military hierarchy of NATO on board, touch down past the midpoint and burn out his brakes before stopping just short of the extreme end of the runway. He just avoided going off the runway and into deep water. During the war, General Sikorski, the Polish head of state in exile, was killed in such an accident. There was no doubt, pilot flying at Gib became very experienced with these conditions, but you are still rather shaken after landing at Gib when they are prevalent. Easter was approaching and Valerie's wedding preparations went ahead full steam. Great excitement was apparent when the day came for Sean to fly in at the completion of his training in England. In the event, he flew in a day early and arrived unannounced at the door, when Valerie was in her curlers, a degree of panic ensued. However, all was well and no damage was done to her image. The wedding itself was a really lovely occasion, held on a beautifully warm sunny day. Valerie wore a magnificent wedding dress made by a Spanish seamstress, with local lace. She looked quite stunning and made me a very proud father as I led her up to the altar. All the officers on the squadron and the station were invited, with a group of squadron officers in full dress, with swords to provide a guard of honor outside the church. The reception was a champagne affair held in the lovely setting of the officers' mess. This was our only daughter and we spent no expense. Gladys was very suitably and beautifully dressed and it was a very memorable day. On departure, the bride and groom were piped by a Scottish officer over the border, much to the delight of the Gibraltarians and Spanish locals, who love such ceremony. Valerie and Sean went to their honeymoon hotel, the one with the chalets which Valerie had chosen just outside Algeciras. Each day we would look across the Bay of Algeciras to the hotel, which was visible from our garden, and wonder how they were. Regrettably, joy turned to sadness when they returned for just a few days. We all felt the strain of their leaving for New Zealand, which seemed so very, very far away. Firstly, they flew out on the R.A.F. Comet scheduled to R.A.F. Lynham in England, where they picked up the RNZ-AF Hastings for the long trip back to New Zealand. I shall never forget the sadness of the night that they left. Still, it was to be no use brooding, for Valerie was obviously happy and deeply in love. They were both so happy and have remained so ever since, but more of their lives together later. After the trauma of Valerie's departure, we endeavored to settle into our new family circumstances and life in Gib. This was not hard to accomplish in a place where there was so much to see and do. Firstly, my dual tasks as OC the squadron and OC flying kept me intensely busy, and by now I had come to grips with all those duties. We also had a new air officer commanding, Air Commodore Deacon Elliott, a former Battle of Britain pilot. There had also been a change of station commander, and the new one was Group Captain Peter Stevens. It did not take long to establish a very good relationship with both. They were both new to the Coastal Command and to Shackletons, but were keen to learn. I began converting them back to the Shack, and this of course helped me get to know them better. The AOC was a natural pilot but tended to fly the Shackleton a bit like a fighter pilot. He had a good sense of humor and we got on fine, both flying, work-wise and socially. Peter Stevens was an ebullient sort of personality and full of fun. However, I soon sensed that he did not get on all that well with the AOC. In some ways this could be difficult for me, as the AOC and I saw very much eye to eye on most matters. As a result, he tended to bypass Stevens and come direct to me. However, it never really caused any major problem. It has always been my policy to lead from the front, and this I did by flying as much, if not more, than most of the squadron captains. By flying regularly with all the crews, I got to know them all very well. Equally, I formed a close association with the ground crew. It was always my policy, before any major exercise or operation, to brief the air crew and then do a separate brief of the ground crew. Insofar as security was concerned, I would tell them more than most COS did. But I would then put them on trust not to let me down by talking to anyone on matters involving security outside the squadron. They never let me down, but it gave them a sense of purpose and of pride that they were taken into my confidence. By always establishing this close liaison, I found I got loyalty and superb efforts from the ground crew on all the units I have commanded. The summer months of 1965 we taken up mostly with flying locally on minor exercises and routine training, which enabled us to get to know Gibraltar very well. There was so much to see in this very historic colony, which has seen the whole spectrum of North Africa, Spanish and European colonizers come and go. Moroccan, French, Dutch and British occupations have all made their mark and left pieces of history on Gib. The famous apes were always an attraction to tourists and visitors. The story is that if the Barbary apes leave Gib, Britain would lose the colony. As a result, special protection measures were employed by the British Army. There is even an NCO whose sole duty is to organize the feeding and welfare of the apes. These creatures can be quite vicious at times, and one has to be careful when approaching them closely. Many a tourist has had their camera or binoculars snatched away, for they tend to be attracted by bright things. There are at times quite vicious fights between the two packs of apes, the upper rock and the lower rock packs. Another problem is one that affects people living in houses higher up the side of the rock, as the apes tend to get in open doors and windows to steal food. The view from the highest points on the rock are superb, as one overlooks Spain, Morocco, the shipping in the straits and along the southern and northern Mediterranean coasts. We started to take regular trips into Spain on our days and evenings off, and the favorite pastime was to walk over the frontier into La Linea and go round the many bars. Booze was cheap, especially wine and sherry, and any serviceman who ever served in Gib will know of the famed Dick's Bar, a favorite place to buy sherry from the big wooden casks. One could have a few sherries and then take a flagon home duty free, for next to nothing, plus the fact it was beautiful sherry. I had a passion for going over with friends to watch the bullfights, where the atmosphere was fantastic. Although too many people, bullfights are considered cruel. I enjoyed watching the skill, finesse and bravery of the matadors, pitching their wits against the brute force and passion of the bull. We would also go up the coast to the many fishing villages and resorts to swim and enjoy eating and drinking in the many and varied restaurants and cafes. The swimming was also more enjoyable than Gib, because it was the warmer Mediterranean Sea rather than the cold Atlantic waters. Whilst we were in Gib, the now famous Sotogrund golf course opened. Of course, cut out of the cork tree forest only 15 minutes from Gib. A few of us struck a friendship with a Spanish customs officer who was also a keen golfer. This became very useful later on when we experienced border troubles, limiting movement to and from Gib to Spain. One day whilst playing, there was one very amusing incident, involving Ernesto Villeneuve, the officer concerned. One morning before we played golf, he had been duck shooting and shot no ducks at all. However, in the afternoon, while we played Sotogrund, he struck a bird on the head with this ball playing a number 3 iron. We suggested that in future he should limit his duck shooting pursuit to the golf course. I once killed a 5-foot-long snake which came across our fairway, by using a 5-iron and cracking it across the back of the neck to do so. On another occasion at Sotogrund, we finished playing and were sitting on the golf clubhouse veranda having a drink, when a largish entourage of people were seen coming up the 18th fairway. A number of very elegant and well-dressed people also came out into the patio where we were seated. As the golfers came in there was much bowing and courtesy to one rather tall handsome Spaniard. It turned out to be King Don Juan, the pretender to the Spanish throne and the father of the present king, King Juan Carlos. On another day Yul Brynner, the film star, was there, enjoying a swim and a game. One of our favorite days out and one which we often took friends visiting Gib. With us was Taronda, a lovely old town in the hills north of Malaga. We would drive from Linear, work our way inland to Ronda and lunch at the Victoria Regina Hotel, a most elegant place indeed. We would then drive through the hills into Malaga and have a look around this beautiful city. Finally, we would drive back all along the coast to Gib. It made a superb day out, but sometimes we would stay overnight in Ronda at the hotel. In the town was the oldest bullring in Spain, a very picturesque place to view. On our holidays we would go further afield into Spain and Portugal, usually staying in small village hotels. One holiday we had was a lovely week in Lisbon, the magnificent capital of Portugal. Of course, I regularly flew up to Lisbon Airport on training divisions, for at that time it was the only nearby airport where we could practice ILS approaches. The Spaniards would not let us use Malaga, the nearest diversion. We were seldom without visitors, if not to stay with us, then to stay in Gib. Air Commodore Gordon Finlayson from my staff college days visited quite often in his yacht. He was retired and had a villa in Spain near Gib. On the Costa del Sol, he invited us over one evening and we enjoyed a superb party, including a marvelous display of flamenco dancing, so special of Andalusia, the province next to Gib. Air Commodore Alan Deere, the New Zealand fighter ace, and his lovely wife Joan came and spent a couple of days with us on their way through to Spain. We were now getting to the end of summer and the ceremony for the presentation of the squadron standard was getting near. It was to take place on the 20th of October. Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Allworthy, as Chief of Air Staff, was to present the standard, on behalf of Her Majesty the Queen, as the border tensions with Spain had intensified. It was not considered diplomatic for any member of the royal family to perform the presentation. The main irritant was that the Spaniards used delay tactics for anyone trying to get in and out of Spain. They would conduct endless searches of people and cars, processing 1 car per hour, making it almost impossible to go for the day into Spain as we had earlier. There was little delay in walking across, so I arranged to get my private car over into La Linea where I found a backstreet garage to house it. We would then walk over and pick up the car to have our days out in Spain. Eventually, the Spanish government stopped the huge workforce from crossing into Gib. And this caused some problems at first. The British government responded by bringing an R.A.A.F fighter squadron of Hunter aircraft into Gib. They also used Gib more regularly for Royal Naval vessels in order to show a strong presence. We could not take off normally from Gib without entering the Spanish airspace, and they got very difficult over all clearances of both military and civil aircraft flying in and out of Gib. The way we got round this was to change our approach patterns to avoid going into their airspace, which became rather tedious. One perk Gladys and I lost was our 2 Spanish maids, so we had to go back to cooking and cleaning as in UK more service personnel were brought in to make up for the loss of Spanish labor. In addition, a large number of Moroccans came over to work in the colony. Fruit and vegetables etc. also brought in from North Africa to make up for the loss of Spanish produce. The daily scheduled ferry in the aircraft, a DC-3 of Gib. Air got a lot more usage for their trips to Tangier. My old navigator, Alex Mackenzie, and his wife Frida came and spent 10 days with us. Whilst staying with us, we all went over to Tangier for the night. It was a considerable cultural change and therefore most enjoyable, as we visited the souk and the Casbah, and other sites. Captain Don Delph, a real character, who skippered the ferry from Gib, had us all on the bridge going into Tangier and back to Gib. He even let Gladys sound the ship's horn on entering Gibraltar Harbour. Don, a former naval officer, was great fun and an honorary member of our officers' mess. But Gib was full of characters like Don. The Alex Guinness film, Captain's Paradise, was based on the Gib-Tangier ferry schedule. Apart from Tangier, I got to Rabat, the capital of Morocco, quite frequently. We had a Pembroke aircraft for the AOC and I was able to fly it. Once per month we had a duty run to the British Embassy in Rabat, mostly to take liquor supplies to them, a trip I went with the AOC's pilot, Flight Lieutenant Dixie Dean. We had a good arrangement, whereby one of us would fly it down to Rabat and the other fly back. The one who took it down could enjoy a drink or two over lunch at one of the finer Rabat restaurants, or at one of the homes of the British Embassy staff. It also became a very useful way of offsetting the loss of fruit supplies from Spain, because there was an abundance of good produce in Morocco. The champagne is excellent and much cheaper than the French variety. All our parties in Gib for special occasions, or just any excuse we could dream up, were a good reason for getting out champers from Morocco. At 11 shillings per bottle a mess at Gib. Kept a big stock. The squadron was relieved of its frontline duties for a month prior to the standard presentation, which enabled us to concentrate on working up to a high standard of ceremonial drill for the parade. Another squadron sent an aircraft and crews down to provide search and rescue standby, which 224 normally provided, for the final few days of the build-up and the parade itself. I went up to UK to see the Commander-in-Chief, Air Marshal Sir Paul Holder, to discuss all the arrangements for the parade and associated social events. I flew up to London Airport in a BEA Vanguard, and as OC flying Gib, the captain had me up on the flight deck all the way. It was very interesting to be on the flight deck for the first time going into London Airport. Finally all was ready for the great day and I was happy with the standard of drill and turnout, as were the AOC and the station commander. The visitors, mostly extra 124 members, all began to arrive from UK and other places. We even had a Canadian Air Force aircraft carrying a famous wartime 224 pilot, a chap who had sunk 2 U-boats in 20 minutes during the war in the Atlantic. Many former COS came along as well. My old friend Pete Coveyson and the air attaché and his wife from Madrid stayed at our home. There was to be disappointment, as regards the Chief of Air Staff. The Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, called an urgent Defence Cabinet meeting which the CAS had to attend. He therefore had to cancel his visits to Gib. The Commander-in-Chief made the presentation on CAS behalf. It so happened that the famous TV personality Alan Wicker was in Gib at the time doing a documentary. He came up to the mess and spent an evening with us, proving a very interesting and pleasant person. The final disappointment was the day itself. Unfortunately, October can be one of Gib's worst months for weather and this proved no exception. It hosed down all day and we had to hold the parade in a hangar, which is always difficult due to the poor acoustics and restricted space. Despite this setback, it all went very well and I was congratulated personally by the Commander-in-Chief on the squadron's performance and my own. That evening we held a big reception, to which the guest of honor was the Governor of Gibraltar. The squadron did very well and I was mighty proud of them all, for they had paraded well, looked good and socially were excellent hosts. It was a proud day for the squadron. Flying Officer Ray Caron, a fine young officer with the right height and bearing, proved a first-class standard bearer. Ray flew with me quite often and I later gave him his captaincy. He later joined the R.A.A.F and then retired in New Zealand, so I see him regularly. The great day over, so it was back to work as a normal squadron. Despite the weather and the disappointment at the CAS not being able to attend, the day had still been a success and a landmark in the history of this famous squadron. Immediately after the standard presentation, the squadron was brought back into frontline service. This meant mounting the regular 24-hour search and rescue standby again and required an aircraft and a crew to be on call at 1 hour's readiness throughout the 24-hour period. The service was frequently called out to search for missing aircraft, vessels, and to incidents at sea. Another routine task was the regular requirement to shadow Russian ships on spy missions or other clandestine activity. As a matter of course, we reported all Russian shipping sighted and identified. They were used to this activity, and as we flew over we could usually see them waving to us. Our next major operation was in November, where we were to relieve No. 37 Squadron in Aden, whilst they went to Londonderry for the 3 weeks JAS training. Their CO Vic Balderstone was an old chum from my staff college course. Whilst I was away I managed to arrange for Gladys to take her first flight ever. She went to UK on an R.A.F Comet on the regular schedule to UK, and it was a very nervous lady that we ushered into the aircraft. Fortunately, the captain was a regular visitor to Gib, so he looked after her very well. On the 7th of November we flew directly to the R.A.F station at Akrotiri in Cyprus. I had taken over Flight Lieutenant Collins' crew for the operation and now had our standard bearer, Ray Karen, as my co-pilot. We flew overnight, which took 10.5 hours, arriving in Cyprus soon after dawn. I had never been there before, so it was pleasing that we were to have a whole day clear to look around. The station commander was Group Captain David Hughes, another old friend from Bracknell who met us on arrival. After a few hours sleep he picked up Ray and I and gave us a tour of the big base at Akrotiri. That evening he took a bunch of us into Limnassol, the nearest town, where we enjoyed the local wine and shish kebab, a specialty of Cyprus. The next morning we set off for Aden, a flight over Egypt and down the Red Sea lasting 8 hours. Aden was experiencing troubles with the Yemenis and there were quite a few nasty incidents involving them and their local supporters. Upcountry their army and air force were frequently fighting local tribes, supporters of the North Yemenis, who wanted to take over the whole of Aden. There was a British plan to pull out of the protectorate, and that was hoped that forces friendly to UK would take over. Many of the areas were controlled by friendly sheikhs, who had to be protected by the British forces from the Yemeni-inspired harassment. The 224 Squadron Detachment took over the 37 Squadron role of search and rescue standby and also regular patrols over the interior of the Aden country areas, reporting on all activity observed. There was tight security everywhere, which was very necessary, proved by the fact that whilst we were in Aden there were several bombing incidents, where bombs were placed and exploded in British government and military installations. It was a tense atmosphere, but there was, however, a very good beach which was under constant army protection where servicemen and their families could bath in safety. We all took advantage of this to the full. Compared to Gib, Aden was mighty hot, so we had to be careful not to suffer sunburn. One advantage was that Aden was a duty-free port, so we could stock up with all sorts of goodies, cameras, radios, TVs, jewelry and many other things could be bought cheaper than anywhere else in the world at that time. Naturally, we all made the most of this unique opportunity. Fortunately we had plenty of room on our aircraft to carry our loot home. The flying was interesting, but it was intensely hot near the ground and it was a considerable relief to climb up to cooler altitudes. There were 2 very fascinating sorties we carried out, one being a patrol into the interior of the Aden Protectorate, which was mostly over desert and very barren and quite inhospitable country. There was, however, one incredible contrast, and that was along the valley of Hadramaut, which had ample supplies of water from the artesian wells. It was a strip of lush fertile land, peppered with villages, all forming small sheikdoms. Here were the loyal sheikhs and it was they who supplied Aden with fresh produce. In one of the more barren valleys there were 2 well-defined rounded hills on either side. Each one had a small pillbox on top as a lookout post, which resembled a certain erotic part of the female anatomy. Not surprisingly, and with typical British Army humour, these 2 hills, plus pillboxes, had always been known as the Queen of Sheba's tits. One could imagine the stoical British Tommy, cut off from female company, getting some sort of twisted humour from this observation. British soldiers, pre-war, did a 7-year stint in Aden, and it must have been a pretty tough assignment in all that heat and in such unfriendly terrain. The other interesting feature which suddenly appeared, after a long stretch of flying over barren desert, was one isolated fort, a real live scene out of Bojest. On return from one patrol up country, we found it had not been so friendly to us either. At least one of the hostile tribes hadn't. After landing we found a sizable chunk out of one of the inner propellers, in which a .5 caliber shell fitted perfectly. Someone must have fired at us when we were flying low over one of the villages. Another perk of our tour of Aden was for each crew to be able to take an aircraft down to Nairobi, the capital of Kenya, for a 2-day stopover. We flew out and across Somalia and down into Kenya. En route we could see the famed Mount Kilimanjaro. The country from Somalia onwards and over Ethiopia was so different from Aden, so noticeable as we flew over the jungle terrain. We landed at the R.A.F base at Eastleigh, just outside Nairobi. It was a fascinating trip and we were well looked after by the base personnel. We enjoyed a day out in Nairobi and on the second day visited the famed game park. It was my first visit to such a place and I loved seeing the deers, lions, giraffes and rhinoceros in their natural surroundings. My visit was somewhat marred by a very painful attack of sciatica, when I thought that I had a disc gone in my lower back. What happened was quite simple. We had carried out some low-level circuits and landings before we left Aden, with the cold air vent being open to offset the heat at low level. Unfortunately, the flight engineer had not shut the vent when we climbed up to 10,000 feet to fly down to Nairobi. Thus, my back had been subjected to considerable sweat and heat at Aden, and then suffered a cold air blast at altitude, the perfect recipe for sciatica. Fortunately, I soon recovered and was okay on our second day in Nairobi. Before leaving Aden I was given a 2-hour session of duel on a Hawker Hunter fighter, my first introduction to this beautiful aircraft. Also whilst at the base, we were invited to farewell drinks at the station commander's house. He was Group Captain Michael Beetham, later to become CAS. The next day we flew back to Gib. Along the Red Sea, over Cairo, as it was clear day, we could easily pick out the pyramids. Strangely enough, although UK had no diplomatic relations with Egypt at the time, diplomatic clearance was obtained, courtesy of the Canadian Embassy. The price must have been right. We spent the night at the R.A.F base at El Aden on the Libyan coast, arriving there just in time to avoid a huge sandstorm. The night was most unpleasant and despite being in the desert it was bitterly cold, particularly noticeable to us after 3 weeks in the heat of Aden. The next day we flew the 9-hour trip along the Mediterranean coast and over to Malta and on to Gib. It had been a very interesting detachment and Ray Karen had proved himself to me as a competent officer and pilot and ready to be awarded his captaincy. Naturally he was delighted, but it was well merited. Just after Christmas I had the honor of taking the governor of Gibraltar on a 2-hour flight, in which we showed him all of the facets of our crew training. He was very interested and on return thanked us all warmly and congratulated us on our skills. The Gibraltar press met us on our return and suitable photos and write-ups appeared next day, all good PR for 224. A few days later I was off again, this time to Malta carrying the AOC and the Army Brigadier. We flew the 7.5 hours to the R.A.F base at Luga, where the CO Group Captain Colin Fell met us. I had known him for many years and he invited me to dinner on one of our evenings there. We had no tasks until a flight back on the Monday, so we just did some sightseeing and played a bit of golf. I had never been to Malta before and found it interesting after all one had heard about it during the war. The flight back was eventful for 2 reasons. Firstly, we picked up a radar contact halfway back to Gib. The radar operator was sure we had a submarine periscope just above the water, showing us such on his radar. We carried out the normal mock attack routine and sure enough into view came the apparent periscope wake. However, as we flew over the top at 50 feet we identified a huge whale. In fact there were about 10 of them and they just kept on going and every so often blowing water spouts as whales do. Even though we circled at very low level to take photographs, they took absolutely no notice and just held their course, making a quite fascinating sight. The second event on this trip was that I passed my flying total of 5,000 hours. On arrival back at Gib, we were met by my adjutant Mike Hill, with a tray of champagne, plus a photographer to record the event. Later on, After the press published a photo of our return, I received a large bottle of champagne from a local dignitary, Louis Stagnetto. He was an ex-British Army paratrooper and a local councillor. It was a nice touch. Everything in the garden appeared to be lovely. The squadron had success after success, winning the main Coastal Command trophies, including the Ed and Fincastle Trophy, the latter competed for by several overseas air forces. The AOC had told me that at the end of my tour he was pushing for me to be promoted to group captain. As so often in life when all looks so rosy, there is a huge coming down to earth, and it all started with good news at first, when we learned Valerie was to expect her first baby. All seemed well, but then a few weeks before it was due she wrote to tell us that she had suffered an electric shock. The doctors reckoned the baby was alright, but then at the time it was due we received the shattering news, by telegram, that the baby was stillborn. We were devastated and felt so helpless, especially with us being so far away. Fortunately, we had two very good friends staying with us, Joan Metcalf and Elsie Lee, both hold of whom were R.A.A.F nursing sisters. They were very sympathetic and suggested we leave Gib. For a day or so, we were going to take them into Spain, during their stay anyway, so we went to Ronda and Malaga for the weekend. I discussed with Gladys the prospect of my trying to get leave to go to New Zealand to see Valerie and she agreed. The station commander also thought that I should try and get to see Valerie. I was able to arrange various indulgence flights, with the help of friends. And I flew on an R.A.A.F Beverley to Abingdon near Oxford and then a day later flew from R.A.A.F Lynham in an R.A.A.F Comet to Singapore. I spent the Sunday at Lynham with the station commander, Group Captain Freddie Hazelwood and his wife Isabel, with whom we had been with at Kinloss in our 3-year tour earlier. I got to Singapore, but there was no R.A.F flight I could get from there to New Zealand, so I flew BOAC to Sydney and Air New Zealand to Wellington. It was a short 30-minute flight from Wellington to Woodburn, near Blenheim in the South Island, where Sean and Valerie met me. It was a very emotional welcome and until a day before, a complete surprise for Valerie. I spent 10 days helping them get over their loss, and I learned that it was a baby girl they had which was dead at birth. Valerie was very depressed at first, but my visit did help her a lot. It also enabled me to give her the feeling that we were not so far away after all. Sadly, at the end of the 10 days I set off for Gib. Again, the CO at Woodburn helped me get a USAF flight out of Christchurch to Sydney. He in fact flew me down personally in a Devon to Christchurch, where I picked up a C-119 American transport and flew into R.A.A.F Richmond near Sydney. Alan Reid, whom I had been with at Edinburgh Field, helped me get on R.A.A.F Hercules to Darwin. There I seemed to get stuck, but fortunately a civil airline Britannia on a return emigrant flight was able to take me to Singapore. Here I got a Comet to Lynham and then a Hastings the next day to Gib. I was one day overdue after this epic journey. Although it was good to be able to give Gladys the assurance that Valerie was okay and would get over her loss in time, it did leave the feeling of awful family separation which did not go away. I settled down to get on with my duties, which included a very good week with a Fleet Air Arm detachment. Their squadrons flew into Gib, and then rejoined the carrier HMS Hermes later. I had a very enjoyable day on the carrier watching their aircraft operating. We had just learned that 224th Squadron was to equip with the Shackleton Mark III, a tricycle undercarriage version with lots of other improvements all round. The squadron was thrilled at the news. And then out of the blue came an announcement from the British government that there were to be extensive defense cutbacks. The worst news was that in these cuts 224th Squadron was to be disbanded. It was a dreadful blow for us all. The squadron had been in Gib 15 years and was regarded by the Gibraltarians as their own. This was the last straw for me. Later I was told that I would be posted to HQ Coastal Command when the squadron disbanded. These series of events caused me to think very deeply about my future in the service, for I wondered if it was to be all worthwhile. I discussed with Gladys the possibility of leaving the service and moving to New Zealand. Although she would like to see Valerie and be nearer to her, she said I still had my career and that it was for me to decide. Whatever I did decide, she would go along with it. After considerable heart searching, I decided to leave the service and go to New Zealand. I advised the CO and he told the AOC. They both tried to dissuade me, but my mind was made up. The Ministry of Defense Personnel Department came up with a helping hand. In order to be closer to New Zealand, they suggested that I reposted to Singapore after the squadron disbanded, and then I can decide from there if I still wanted to leave the service. This was an acceptable alternative, and after a trip to London to discuss this and the squadron disbandment ceremony, this plan was adopted. The next 2 months were very much a sad affair as the squadron gradually closed down. The Gibraltar government held a reception in honor of the squadron, at which I gave the farewell speech, dwelling on the history of the squadron and its association with Gibraltar and its people. It was indeed a sad occasion. I flew my last sortie with Group Captain Peter Stevens on board on the 12th of October, 1966, and took a nostalgic look all around the area where the squadron had flown for so long. We were now down to one aircraft, the other Shackletons having flown away. We still had the Pembroke on the station, and I did a few flights in that, including a final trip to Rabat. We booked to sail on a Swedish car and passenger ferry to Southampton, and after all the sad farewell parties left for UK, a big crowd of well-wishers farewelled us from the dockside as we sailed from Gib for the last time. What had all seemed so promising had disappeared. The success of the squadron under my command, my own promising future, Valerie's wedding, all seemed to be lost into oblivion as Gibraltar disappeared out of sight. I have pondered long and hard over it all and considered what might have been. Now we had to pick up the pieces and make the best of it all. There was no doubt, even if I was staying in the service, I would have no chance of further promotion. The R.A.F would be very unlikely to promote an officer of wing commander rank who had expressed a wish to leave the service. That bridge was truly burned. We now had to look forward to a return to Singapore and at least being closer to New Zealand and Valerie. There comes a time in all men's lives when they reach a crossroad. Which way to go? They must make their decision as I made mine, but I have wondered ever since if it was the right one. I really doubt if I will even know. However, I have never been one to brood, so I set about making the best of my future life in Singapore. At least I was going to a place I had a great liking for, as did Gladys. Alternatively, we would surely be able to get to see Valerie and Sean in Kiwi Land.